You are listening to Mining Stock Education, where you'll learn from the top leaders in the natural resource sector and uncover quality mining investment opportunities.
As far as the futures market goes, so much of it is dependent upon world trade that with all the beef coming out of America and going elsewhere, it'd be very hard to make a call and say, now would be a good time to jump into that, because you just don't know. You'd probably be better off shorting it. Even though that you would think that a comeback is coming, all it would take would be for another large buyer of exported U.S. beef to say, we're shutting down, and just like that, straight down again.
Welcome back to Mining Stock Education. I'm your host, Bill Powers. Thank you for tuning in. Well, we focus a lot on the precious metals and different investment vehicles in the mining sector, but we also from time to time focus on natural resource investing, which includes mining, but also includes things like agriculture and such. True wealth comes from the earth, whether it's mined, dug out of the earth via mining companies, or whether it's raised, whether it's agriculture, cotton, cattle, lambs, chicken. And so as I've been just seeing how various things have been impacted by this worldwide crisis, I've taken a note of how it's affected the U.S. cattle industry, where cattle futures have been plummeting, yet at the same time that cattle futures in the U.S. have been going down, ground beef prices have risen as much as 3 times since the beginning of March. So I have a good friend. Our families have been friends for about 10 years. His name is Ben Smith. He is a small cattle farmer near Lansing, Michigan, which is my state's capital, right in the middle and lower half of the lower peninsula of Michigan. Ben has extensive experience on the processing side prior to starting his own cattle farm, and he's been cattle farming now for several years, so he understands the whole supply chain. And I asked him to come on the show today to share his insights and his perspective of what's going on and what possible investment opportunities might arise out of this crisis. So Ben, it's nice to talk to you in this format. Welcome to Mining Stock Education. And just so listeners could get to know you a little more, could you share a little bit more about your background and how did you come to start your farm?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I grew up in Detroit, and my dad had worked at a meatpacking company there for his only job, 40 years. And I went to work there out of college. After I did a couple other jobs first, I went there for about 9 years. And it was a meat distributor and a processor in downtown Detroit. Substantial volume goes through Detroit as a city from out west, moving out east, and then back and forth. But I did that for about 9 years, and because of some health issues that our family had, we think related to the meat that we were getting from there, it's just commodity meat. We decided that we were going to farm and produce it ourselves. We had been buying from farms, and we found that it helped us in our health. And so we decided to make the change. We bought 100 acres out here, sold everything, moved out here in 2014, and got to know some of the producers on this side of the state, and just started to make a go of it. Grass-fed beef, some other items, basically whatever we can produce on 100 acres, and not thinking that moving to a farm and raising our own meat would have anything to do with my prior experience at the meatpacking company. And people had been telling me that, are you able to use anything that you've learned from the meatpacking industry on the farm? And I thought, no, probably not. But it really has helped out a lot in knowing what people like to eat, how they like it cut. And now it's even more applicable with everything that's going on in the beef industry and being able to understand it, as opposed to just being totally confused and living out here on 100 acres, kind of in the middle of nowhere here in Michigan.
Could you, Ben, just give us a simplistic overview of the cattle supply chain from start to end? Could we begin our discussion there?
The majority of cattle in our country comes from cow-calf operations, which is where the rancher owns a bull or multiple bulls and cows. They have calves. They raise those calves to a certain point, and then they just start to grow and move out. And from there, they will go to another farm, or they'll go right to a feedlot. And then from the feedlot, they go to an auction or directly to the meat packers, who then package them, process them, package them, box them, store them, and then sell them. And There's currently about 600 to 600,000 head per week that are being slaughtered in the U.S. for beef. So we're by far the largest in the world, and it is feeding the world to some degree because of export. But a good portion of that goes to food service, and then a good portion of it goes to retail, and a good portion of it gets frozen. But a lot of it is fresh, and it's just a constant cycle. And the packers control the prices, and the packers control how much they pay for the live animals that they buy and contract directly for and ship directly to their processing facilities. So they are the drivers of that world.
So they are the key manipulators. Could I use that term?
Yes, they control everything. In fact, the largest packers will own a substantial amount of the farms or the feedlots where they get the beef from, because that further insulates them from price fluctuations if they can control that part of it too. In fact, Cargill, the second largest, I believe, owns a good portion of everything from start to finish. The seeds, the land, the grain, all the way through to the box beef.
So as I mentioned in my introduction, we have the regular price of ground beef skyrocketing, going up 3 times, 200%, but at the same time, cattle futures are plummeting. So are the processors to blame for this?
Well, since they're the ones who set the prices, then they can decide what they're going to buy, where they're going to buy it, and who they're going to buy it from. So if you are a rancher and you have, say, 5,000 head of cattle that you take to the auction when they're ready to go in, and you already know that date to the day when they're ready to go in, and you go there and they're paying you 30 to 40% less, then you just have to take it. There's really no other option. The cattle have to be gone, or at that point, the rancher has to continue to feed them, or the feedlot has to continue to feed them, and money is gone out of their pocket with the current situation, no end in sight, because they don't know when the markets are going to go up or when the packers are going to pay more. So right now, the packers are setting the prices that they're paying for the cattle, but then they're setting the prices based on the demand when they sell them to the food service companies and the retailers like Costco and Kroger and your nationwide retailers. So they're in charge of both of those prices. And then they're also in charge of how many hours of production they put in at their processing plants. When you add the government into that, telling them that they need to be closed, or that half of their supply chain is closed, which is the food service distributors, then you get into a situation where we have to raise the price on the retail items because we're not getting paid anything for the food service items. And then we have to close the plants because we're being told that there's people there that are sick, so they have to be closed.
So there's the processors, the packers, they could legitimately point to the COVID-19 crisis as the cause of this, and they couldn't only rightfully be accused of price gouging.
Right. And it's not really price gouging when you think about how much it actually costs to produce a beef animal. It takes 16 to 18 months minimum. And if you were planning on getting paid $12 a pound for a good 25% of it, if you're getting paid a certain amount of money for it, and then the other half you were selling for just a couple bucks just to keep it moving, there's nothing you could do when that other half goes away except freeze it or add it to the cheaper product. When I say that, I mean grinding up the more expensive parts of the animal because you have to. And I think there's some of that going on because the price of ground beef is so high, but I think it's more because they can close these plants because they're being told to close the plants. That's certainly part of it, but it's also convenient to close the plants because they're not getting paid anything for half the product. So if they just continued at the exact same levels, you could see the glut of product that would flood the market.
So if the government says, okay, everybody back to work, and all the state governors, including ours, says go back to work, would they even be able, the processors, to function and process at 100% capacity again? Or with all the restrictions, the face masks, the 6 feet away, is this the capacity potential of this business not even where it was prior to this crisis?
For sure. If they, the other factor here is you've got employees there who may or may not be very healthy individuals to begin with, and they are afraid, and they're feeling susceptible to the virus. So just like with the auto companies that we've seen here in Detroit, they're demanding to be temperature checked, spaced out. I was listening to the Detroit radio yesterday, and they were talking about how there's going to be like a 6 or 7 point safety check before you can enter General Motors to start work. So that's going to take time. Meat packing, everything is by the second basically. And then the assembly lines are tighter than auto industry. They're lined up just right next to each other, right on top of each other. And if you have to space them out, then I just don't see, the only thing you could really do is open up more plants, spread people out more, which they could do, except that's going to cost a lot of money too. So there are many different layers of it here, but at the same time, if they cut everything back, and if they have freezer inventory, which is documented somewhere, I don't know where it is, but there is an agency that keeps track of freezer storage in our country. They could lean on that right now and get paid premium dollar for that while they deal with all of this.
With the supply chain and the resumption of normalcy, what would be one of the key things we would look for? Would it be the restaurants opening back up? I mean, and even when they open back up, my expectation is that 40% of them won't open back up.
Yeah, if they're hanging on by a thread, there's no way. I don't think there's any amount of stimulus money that's going to be able to get them to come back, because you have that unemployment factor too, where people are getting paid way more than they were to wash dishes at a restaurant. But yes, if those open back up, I've been watching the prices of some of these higher commodities like beef tenderloin and New York strips and the ribeyes, and they're back up where they were before. And that tells me that somebody is anticipating them being worth something again sometime soon. So they're buying them and freezing them, or they're buying them and cutting them and then freezing them, these expensive cuts to prepare. There was a time when they were less than ground beef is right now. So I would look for, the restaurants to be open. That'll obviously, because Cisco is a very large company that distributes basically to every city in the country food service, and they only go to restaurants. They don't do really any retail at all. So when you start to see their trucks on the road, when you start to see restaurants reopen, then that means meat is going through that portion of the system. But right now, I don't see any of that going on, at least in Michigan.
You mentioned Cisco. You're speaking to investors right now. This is an investing podcast. With you knowing the supply chain, being a farmer, cattle farmer yourself, where might be some investment possibilities that could arise out of this crisis?
Well, there's public companies, but a lot of the companies that are in the meat industry are privately owned. Families that have started a company and it's just grown and grown and grown and grown and grown. And then you've got the really large companies that are owned by other countries, or companies in other countries that, whether or not they're even public, I'm not sure. I know Smithfield would not be because they're in China. But as far as an investment opportunity goes, as things ramp back up again, it's very hard to say because we don't know. Beef is a luxury, and if the true cost of producing it was factored into the price that it sells for, most people wouldn't be able to afford it, which is why in other countries, beef at a restaurant or beef in a grocery store is extremely expensive. You're not usually eating it if you go overseas. So there's going to be a bit of a breakdown in that, I think, and it's already, you can see it at the stores. Where to invest in that side of it, you're going to have to look for something that is not susceptible to some type of a government intervention and that can survive and thrive. Yeah, you're going to have to look for something that can survive and thrive when the government gets involved, or when there's mandates put in place that a packer would have to comply with. You're going to have to look for something that can go around that or can navigate through that. And the only way to do that is to look to smaller rather than bigger. And as far as an investment opportunity goes, that makes it kind of tricky. I don't know, what it looks like from behind a desk or from a speculative position to look at investing in the meat business. Especially like I said before, because a lot of them are private companies, but there's certainly going to be a much greater need for processing on a micro level instead of these massive meat packing plants. Because if they're going to go back to work and they've got to be 6 feet apart, more meat is going to be traded at a local level than it is at this national level like this. I'm sure cattle ranchers out west would not agree or would not like to hear that, but there is a company that is out in Oregon, and it's a group of I want to say 200 or 300 farms, and it's a co-op, and they literally have annual meetings where they all stand around in a circle. They invite all their suppliers, and they set their prices for the entire year, and they've got their processing book for the entire year, and it's 5,000 head or something like that per quarter, and it goes straight to the stores. And I met the guy last fall, and I'm wondering how they're doing, but I'm guessing in all this, they are doing just fine, except for the fact that, again, they have to use a large processor in order to get their stuff done. And if that processor closes, there is nowhere else to go. So you really have to keep looking smaller in order to see where the investment opportunities are.
That makes sense. What about speculating in the futures market? Do you think that's futility now with cattle prices this low? What would be your thoughts here?
It would be hard. It would be hard to make a definitive call on that, because a lot of that future speculation is based on export too. And some of these countries, I was listening to another program on the radio yesterday, and they were hailing Argentina for their arrest and lockdown, and you can get arrested and fined if you go outside right from the start, March 20th on, and how they're claiming that their president is making all the right moves, and he's saving lives, and this is the future. And when you hear stuff like that spread out like that should be a good idea, then you look at futures and you say, well, what about the beef that would be imported or exported from there? You have no control over it now if the government says you're going to be arrested for going outside because that's the best way to save lives. So it would be hard to jump into futures and say beef is going to make a comeback when you've got other countries that are hailing people that have made decisions of shutting everything down completely. So that makes it tricky. But then again, you look at it and you say, well, on a local level, people still have to eat. So is there a way to tap into that when everything else is not looking so rosy, but then you've got people that still have to eat? So how are they getting their food then? If they're not allowed to go out to eat and they're on lockdown, but maybe they're allowed to go to their local store, or maybe they're allowed to do something on their own, what would that look like for investing? That's where it gets very confusing. But as far as the futures market goes, so much of it is dependent upon world trade that with all the beef coming out of America and going elsewhere, it'd be very hard to make a call and say now would be a good time to jump into that, because you just don't know. It would be, you'd probably be better off shorting it rather than even though that you would think that a comeback is coming. All it would take would be for another large buyer of exported U.S. beef to say we're shutting down, and just like that, straight down again.
Well, as we kind of wrap up this conversation, what practical advice would you like to leave with my listeners? There's a lot of U.S. listeners, but there's also listeners from Canada and all over the world, actually, that are listening to this conversation regarding their families securing the food they need for their family. Is there any practical advice you'd like to leave us with, Ben?
I think a lot of people have been coming to me and saying, are you happy with the decisions that you made in 2014 when you went out to your farm? And I wouldn't call us self-sufficient, because we are still relying on our processors in order to run our business. But the practical advice would be to make yourself as anti-fragile as you can, in that when something like this happens, we had quite a few customers, I believe, including yourself, that had loaded up chest freezers prior to this. And, we had people that were looking for food, which all investments aside, we all need food in order to survive. And they did not have a chest freezer, and they did not have a way to get food that week, and they did not have a way to find a chest freezer. They had other food, obviously, processed food and whatnot, but the food that you need in order to sustain yourself, they didn't have a way to get it, or they didn't have a way to store it once if they wanted to bulk up on it at all. So thinking anti-fragile when the government is taking a hand in matters such as food is a wise way to think.
Excellent advice. And I do buy from Ben. I usually buy a half a cow at a time and put it in the deep freeze and eat it over a period of time. Grass-fed, grass-finished. If you're in Lower Michigan or Northern Indiana or Northern Ohio and you want to buy from Ben, his website is thesmithfamilyfarm.net. Ben, you're a good friend, and I like your meat, and I appreciate our friendship. Thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thank you, Bill.